Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tokyo Living podcast. We've had somewhat of a hiatus throughout 2024. There's been a lot going on in the world of Club 360 and in the world of Sam. But I'm excited to be back on the mic, and I've got some great guests and some interesting topics to bring to you over the next couple of months. My guest today for this relaunch episode is Rebecca McCarroll. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sam. Nice to be here.
Perhaps if we just start with a little bit of an introduction, if you can let us know who you are, where you're from, what you do, and what brought you out to Tokyo.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a registered dietitian and clinical nutritionist from New Zealand. I came to Tokyo for my husband's work. He works for a New Zealand medical device company here in Tokyo. We arrived at the beginning of the year, and I came from the University of Auckland, where I'd spent the last 10 years doing research initially, and then as a professional teaching fellow in the Department of Nutrition in the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences. So yeah, I've got a Master of Health Sciences, a postgrad diploma in dietetics, and a Bachelor of Science in Nutrition.
Very interesting. And as a science nerd, I'm interested. What were your fields of study when you were researching?
So I was quite interested in cardiovascular disease, but the use of mobile technology and the internet to help people with cardiovascular disease improve their nutrition. So I worked on a smartphone app called Salt Switch, which was looking into reducing salt intake for people who had had cardiovascular events. So yeah, big randomized control trial I ran at the time there.
Very interesting. And also of relevance to the episode today, you're also a parent.
Yes. I've got a 3-year-old son and a 4.5-year-old daughter.
Very nice. Okay. This episode will be talking about childhood nutrition. And for the listeners, please do listen to the end. We'll be talking about a webinar that we will be hosting at the start of next month that will be going into some of the topics that we're discussing today, as well as others. So perhaps if we dive straight in and just talk about some of the basics with child's nutrition in terms of key nutrients.
Yeah, well, as soon as I started feeding my kids, I obviously got very interested in this topic. I'd done some research in the past in childhood nutrition, but I was concerned and I was looking into the research around specific nutrients, particularly calcium, vitamin D, iron, healthy fats, and also vitamin B12. And that's more for parents with vegetarian children. Yeah, so I'll just touch on each of them briefly. So with calcium, we mostly get that from cow's milk and non-dairy alternatives. So a popular one here would be soy milk. And the reason calcium is important is because it is actually the most abundant mineral in the body, with 99% contained in the bones and teeth. And it's really, really important in early life for a healthy growing skeleton and to minimize bone loss in older age as well. Some non-dairy options, it's really important if you're giving your child, you're not giving your child dairy products, to choose a suitable alternative that is high in calcium. So my recommendation there would be a full-fat soy milk with added calcium. This has higher energy, protein, fat, and calcium than any other plant-based milk. Some of your oat milks and almond milks are much lower in fat and protein and calcium. And it's just really important that we maximize our children's calcium needs in those early years.
Yeah. Just one thing. So, how important is like the green vegetables to that as well? Because I know that's speaking from experience, that's something that is maybe a little bit harder for kids to eat, or for parents to get kids to eat. How important is that in comparison to calcium sources like dairy?
In comparison to dairy, it's actually way less important, which may be a relief to some parents. You do find some of it in green leafy vegetables, such as your bok choys or your spinach, and it can also be found in almonds, in tofu, and sardines, which children are unlikely to eat. In fact, many children wouldn't eat any of those foods. Dairy products do tend to be quite popular with children, which is good. But of course, if your child is lactose or dairy intolerant, then there are suitable alternatives. Just make sure that the calcium has been added in.
Got it.
Another thing to be aware of is that breast milk and infant formula are also really good sources of calcium. as well. And yeah, so that's great. The main point with calcium, though, is that we don't want our children drinking huge volumes of milk or eating huge volumes of yogurt, mostly just because it displaces other nutrients. So because children tend to like these foods, they can end up being quite a core part of the diet. And so if they have too much, essentially they just eat less of other foods. So I tend to give yogurt and things after a meal. Sometimes if my children aren't eating well before bedtime, if I know they haven't had a good dinner, an hour and a half later before bed, I might give them a bit of plain yogurt with some berries or something in it, just so that I know that they're meeting their needs, but also that they can, get through the night without waking up, because my 3-year-old is very, very hungry. So yeah.
Do you have any sort of rough guidelines in terms of quantities that you would consider excessive and more likely to displace other nutrients?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go more than a cup of milk a day, maybe 150 grams mils of yogurt. But children's stomachs are still pretty little. So yeah, I wouldn't push it too far. The other thing, of course, with very young children is that we tend to give milk after food once they get to about 8 months of age. And we always recommend full fat until children are 3. So it's kind of different for adults versus children, and it's something to be aware of when feeding our kids. Is the rules for us are different from the rules for them. So full fat till 3. Otherwise, if they have low fat, they tend to consume more and they get too much protein for their kidneys to handle, basically. Calcium works in conjunction with another important nutrient, which is vitamin D. So sufficient vitamin D helps to promote calcium absorption and therefore good bone health. And it's also important for immunity as well, which parents might be interested in, given no one wants sickness in the household. There are very low levels of vitamin D in breast milk, and actually quite low levels in foods as well. We can find it in some foods. However, the best source of vitamin D is from the sun. Now, we've got a bit of a problem there because children aren't usually exposed to the sun when they're very young, and then we put on the sunscreen and we're very careful because, of course, the cancer risk. So yeah, it's for some children, particularly children who are indoors a lot, depending on where they live in the world, supplementation may be required. Yeah, so other places that you can find vitamin D, you can get some in egg yolk, fortified margarines and milk, and there's some in fatty fish such as salmon. Yeah, but it is quite difficult, like I said, to get it from diet alone. Children who are at particular risk are those who are breastfed throughout the winter months, particularly in some countries. So I know up in Hokkaido, because of the latitude on the globe, during winter it's really hard to absorb vitamin D. And it's the same actually in the South Island of New Zealand. So it could be worth Googling wherever you are in the world to see what your vitamin D absorption's like from the sun. Because even if you're out in the sun all day without sunscreen, you may not be able to absorb vitamin D at certain times of the year.
So just in terms of vitamin D, do you recommend that people in general get screened and get tested for vitamin D deficiency, or are there certain signs and symptoms of certain conditions that would then cause you to refer someone to get tested?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So with adults in particular, and obviously we're talking about children today, but I recommend most adults at some point in their life get a vitamin D blood test just to see where they are, particularly if they're living in different countries, to get it every time they go somewhere new. It can be quite an expensive test, so different health systems are willing to test it or not for free of charge. Otherwise, you may have to pay a small amount. I would say with children, it's very difficult because no one wants to get their children to do a blood test. People who are more likely to be deficient are children who are born preterm, children with naturally darker skin, children with a mother with low vitamin D levels, because they're more likely to have been born with lower vitamin D, and then their levels decrease during the first few months of life. And those who've had siblings with seizures or rickets. So I think it's worth thinking about. And what happens, at least in New Zealand, is there's actually quite routine vitamin D supplementation for under 2-year-olds. So there's no harm in supplementing without doing the blood test. So for my children, I gave them vitamin D drops, 1 a day, just in their food. And that was enough for the first 2 years of life. And they weren't high risk either. It's just I knew that we didn't absorb good vitamin D in New Zealand.
Okay.
So moving on, iron is another key nutrient, and this is one that I probably thought about the most when I first started feeding my children at 6 months, around 6 months of age. It's an essential nutrient for vital for growth, immunity, and cognitive function. And again, very low in breast milk. There is some iron in formula, but infants' iron stores decrease during the first months of life, and they're really, really reliant on these stores from birth. So these things that can be done to help a child at birth have higher iron, and there's things like delayed cord clamping, where basically the umbilical cord is left not clamped for 2 minutes, and the iron from the placenta runs into the baby, basically the blood, and it helps to get their iron levels up. So that can be done. However, the main key thing is really to start iron as soon as possible when feeding solid foods. So this is true also for children who are older, that heme iron, which is more bioavailable, this means it's more readily absorbed, is found in meat, chicken, and fish. And then non-heme iron is found in some plant-based foods and eggs. So if you're a vegetarian, it's fine. You can still meet your iron requirements for your child. However, you just have to be careful to give them higher iron foods, such as tofu, tempeh, legumes, so like beans, chickpeas, and lentils, and also iron-fortified cereals, your baby cereal type things, or for older children, other cereals can be fortified with iron, and dark green leafy vegetables as well. Liver as well is another good source of iron, and some parents do choose to give this. It is also very high in vitamin A. We don't want to have too much of it. So for very young children, I'd say no more than 3 teaspoons or about 15 grams a week. Risks of low iron, iron deficiency anemia, basically. The cells of the body are unable to carry enough oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. And this can result in tiredness, weakness, headaches, poor cognitive function, immunity, pale skin, and poor resistance to cold temperatures. And also, very, very importantly, it can actually slow the growth as well. Really important to get a good amount of iron in there. So the other key nutrient for children is healthy fats. So we basically call these essential fatty acids. So these are the fatty acids basically that you can't get from you don't make them in your body, so you actually have to eat them. So healthy fats contain fat-soluble vitamins, which are vitamin A, D, E, and K, and they basically help with healthy brain growth, and then also, other things as well, just growth in general. What are healthy fats? So there's 2 different types basically. There's monounsaturated, which is your plant-based oils and your nut oils, olive oil, avocado, nuts, almonds, cashews, hazelnuts, canola oil, peanut, sesame oils, and then your polyunsaturated fats, so your omega-3s and your omega-6. And they mostly come from oily fish, that can also be found in some of the plant-based oils as well. So I just suggest that parents use healthy oils in cooking, essentially. So if they're roasting vegetables or doing some frying in a pan, to use a healthy oil rather than butter, just so that your children are getting enough of those essential fatty acids, which are important for growth. The only other thing I'd really mention is vitamin B12, and that's mostly for vegan children. A deficiency in vitamin B12 is uncommon in non-vegan children. However, vegan children definitely require supplementation. The vitamin B12 can decrease quite rapidly after birth. It is fat soluble, so it takes a couple of months, but it can actually lead to quite serious brain damage if vegan children aren't supplemented with it.
Oh, really? Yeah. And I guess in your experience, what sort of proportion of parents are actually supplementing vegan children with vitamin B12? Is it relatively common, or do you still see that as something that is not well understood?
Yeah, well, it's really hard to measure that. So the parents will often get the supplements, but it's not always clear as to whether the children are taking them as frequently as they should be. There have certainly been court cases around the world where parents have been taken to court for not supplementing their children with B12. Some very, very sad circumstances. But I'd say for the majority of vegan parents, they would be doing this. You can get a small amount from food. It's just questionable as to how much is actually absorbed. I think vegan parents just work with their GP to measure their children's vitamin B12 if necessary through a blood test. And yeah, it can be a really healthy outcome as long as they've got enough of that vitamin.
So as parents, we're exposed to like a ton of different information from news, social media, friends and family. And if we're consuming information outside our own field of expertise, it's hard to know what information is correct and what isn't. But from your perspective as an expert, have there been any sort of research findings that have surprised you, sort of based on your experience and also based on what is assumed to be sort of common knowledge?
Yeah, so just going back to what I was saying about iron, this is one of the real surprises for me, and that's why I focused on it so much when my children been growing, is the very, very high requirements of young children for iron. So infants aged 7 to 12 months are recommended to consume about 11 milligrams a day of iron, which is more than men of any age. And so these are under 12-month-olds. Men of any age, it's 8 milligrams a day. Women, of course, have higher requirements due to menstruation. But yeah, very, very high amounts of iron required from an early age. Another thing is also that iron and other essential nutrients such as calcium decrease in breast milk over time. And you have to be careful about this because I, of course, don't want to not promote breastfeeding, but it just is interesting that by the time a child gets ready for solid foods, around 5-6 months of age, the nutrients in the breast milk is actually depleted. So the child is sometimes waking more frequently. It might not just be because of the nutrients that they're waking, but, they're hungrier and they're kind of seeking out more food and more nutrients. And I just found that fascinating that our bodies have this way of, I guess, engineering us to seek more food, and therefore the breast milk just isn't as complete at that stage. Yeah, and then again, vitamin D. So the needs of an infant are 10 times greater per kg of body weight than those of an adult male. And then of course that's the whole thing about not being exposed to the sun. And the mother's stores being a really important requirement at birth. So this comparison of very, very young children under 1 to male adults just absolutely fascinates me every time.
That is really interesting. Yeah. Just going back to something you said before about the importance of keeping dairy full fat for the first few years, and also the risk of having a child over consume protein. Do you see this in other dietary habits whereby protein might be overconsumed, and what are some of the risks associated with that?
Yeah, I mean, generally protein is overconsumed in general. We really see it in children because of the cow's milk and the yogurt. But with adults in particular, I mean, our requirements of an adult that's not, exercising a lot is between 0.8 and 1 gram of protein per kilogram. So it's actually quite low, and people can be quite surprised about that. It is one of the things. So the risks are basically the risk to the kidneys and the body, and I have seen some kidney damage in people who have overconsumed protein, but also overconsumed other supplements and nutrients. Often it is when you get to that supplementation level that people do tend to really push it over the limit, whether it be a protein powder or shake. Just something to be aware of with kids as well, though.
Yeah, and sometimes I do have the occasional protein bar, and because I tend to buy the protein bars that are delicious, my kids tend to want to eat them, so I try to steer them away from those where possible.
Yeah, and there's huge variety, as you'll be aware. Like in Japan at the moment, I look at some of the protein bars on the shelf, and I'm like, this doesn't contain any protein, and it's
right.
Listed as that, and then vice versa, some of them contain a huge amount for a very small volume. So it's worth checking the label, particularly if you're thinking of giving it to a child.
From a developmental perspective, how does taste actually develop, and what sort of things influence this?
So taste preferences actually develop before a child is even born.
Mm.
So smell and taste systems tend to evolve during the first trimester of pregnancy and are functionally mature well before birth, which may be a surprise to some. Infants of mothers who regularly consumed garlic during pregnancy were shown to have a preference for garlic, and
Yeah.
same with those who consumed carrots. And it's just fascinating that what a mum can consume when a child is so young and not fully grown, like a fetus is not fully grown, can have an impact on that child much later in life. And some of these studies show that the preference actually lasted until a child was 5 years of age. So what you eat while you're pregnant is actually pretty important.
Mm.
Yeah, and evidence demonstrates as well that often infants prefer sweet and umami flavors to sour and bitter tastes, which is kind of natural, I guess, from an evolutionary perspective. That would make sense because, it tastes nicer and it's maybe a bit more dangerous if it was a plant that it was really bitter. However, they can very easily learn to adapt to having sour and bitter tastes from a young age and actually enjoy them as well. But it's really about exposure. So, how many times can you expose a child to that food? Exposing a child to a food might just be putting it on their plate, even if it's thrown off if they're very young. Yeah, so it is just interesting. Studies suggest that children need to be exposed to a novel food between 6 and 15 times before they maybe even put it in their mouths. And for some children, it could be longer than that. So, yeah, it's very variable.
Yeah. I mean, we'll go into this in a minute when we talk about sort of fussy eaters, but is there like a risk of almost pushback? Like if you keep putting something on the kid's plate and they almost develop an aversion to it, can it work the opposite way?
Yeah, I think the language around when you're putting it on the plate is really important and how relaxed you are when you do it. I mean, there are certainly kids out there with developmental issues around eating and some sort of disordered eating patterns. So I'm not talking about these children.
Mm.
I'm talking about children who are otherwise healthy and you're trying to model a positive environment with the food. So what I try to say is it's like a very low pressure situation, and I try to say to the child, I choose what goes on your plate and you choose what you put in your mouth. So there's no expectation if it's on the plate that the child will actually eat the food. And it's very clear. As soon as the child says, I don't want that, take it away, we just say, you don't have to eat it. It's your decision. It's your body. My decision is what I put on the plate. It's your decision what you put in your mouth. And it can be as simple as that. And with my own children, even I've sometimes struggled to keep the food even on the plate. They don't even want it there. They take it off, they put it on the table. Like that is very normal. But yeah, it can be challenging at times. Another thing I try to do in terms of the taste development is trying not to give them foods that are too sweet or too salty, which of course is the ultimate challenge because we're surrounded by sweet and salty foods. And yeah, trying to lower their preference for sweet and salty is quite hard, but it is actually possible. Something you can start at a younger age. The first foods I gave my children were vegetables as opposed to fruit. And then I combined fruit in there too. But trying to get them to accept those more bitter tastes, it's a challenge. It takes a really long time, particularly for older children. But yeah, just saying to them, look, it's your choice whether you have this. And if you don't want it, you don't have to eat it. That's kind of my strategy.
Something I guess that we sort of deal with in our family is, if there is the possibility of like a snack or a dessert after dinner, if they are still hungry, if they know that is a potential option, even though they might be okay to eat what's on their plate, they would prefer to eat something else. What are some strategies for dealing with that type of scenario?
Yeah, I mean that one is really tricky. And my children do do the same. If even with plain yogurt and blueberries, they say, "Oh, I'm just saving room for the yogurt," and I'm like, "Cool, that's not great." So there are two strategies here and different schools of thought. Some dietitians, some pediatric dietitians I know choose to give their children this sweet dessert food with their meal. So it all comes at once. It is, for some people, that is really difficult to do, where many people weren't brought up doing that. It's not a natural thing, and then parents worry that they'll just eat the dessert and not the other food. That's something that a lot of parents do, but I find it really difficult to put the dessert on the plate. Um, so I've taken away the whole idea, aside from when we visit other people's houses, of dessert at all.
Mm.
And I just make a dessert for the children. I don't call it dessert, but it's yogurt with blueberries. It could be, something plain, something that they like, but not something that they adore. It's not a sweet yogurt, it's a plain yogurt, whatever it is for your child. Something that's going to fill their tummy, so you're rest assured that they've had enough to eat. And I actually make quite a big gap between the mealtime and that. So if straight after dinner they say, I want my yogurt, I say, I hear what you're saying. You're telling me you want your yogurt, but we're going to have to wait because it's not yogurt time at the moment.
Yep.
And so it's actually not something that will work straight away, but something, if you have been doing dessert, to make that change, and it will take a while. They're going to throw their toys if they're used to having it. But just making it about, no, that's not for now, but we will have something later, and a really big gap. So then they learn that actually they can eat more and still be hungry enough for their dessert or yogurt later.
Yeah, no, that's useful. Any other strategies for dealing with fussy eaters and children who are you struggling to get them to eat a variety of foods, or at least sort of the more nutritious foods?
Yeah. So I tend to not glorify unhealthy foods or healthy foods for that matter. So one example of this is children love packets. They love packeted food. And so I actually try and remove packets where possible. Even if I know it's like a sweet, I guess, treat type food, I will remove a packet and try and, before they even see the packet, and try and give it to them like that, just to remove some of those sensory feelings they get when they see a packet and it's rustling and they know it's going to be a sweet or salty food. So that's one thing. And again, just the positive environment to promote the acceptance of foods. There has to be an acceptance as well for parents of young children under 5, that almost all children will go through a stage of selective eating where they only eat a couple of foods. And it's worse for some children than others, but it is also very normal. So keeping really calm, keeping a calm environment around the house at dinner time, at mealtime. I always make my children stay at the table until everyone is finished eating, because as soon as one of them goes, the other one gets distracted and wants to go play with their toys too. So trying to make mealtime a bit of a ceremony in a way, always sitting down with my children, which can again be difficult if I'm still in the kitchen wanting to tidy up, particularly if I'm not hungry myself. I do try and eat something with the children, eat the same thing as them, even if it's just a tiny portion, to model that behavior. So sitting there with them, certainly no walking around the house with food. It's different. There are circumstances where friends will come over and other children will be walking around with food. And at times like that, I'm like, just do what you want to my kids. But in general, we have rules around when we're eating, we sit down, we're at the table, even if it's a snack. And trying to make children and allow them to be hungry at mealtime. So limiting some of those snacks, which is really difficult when you're cooking and your child's at your ankles and they're hungry and they're tired. So we actually, for my 3.5-year-old and 4-year-old, dinner time in our house is 5 p.m., which is like depressingly early for me. Yeah, but I know that my kids finish school at 3. They come home, they have their afternoon snack. They sometimes have 2 afternoon snacks. I know that I pretty much can't get away with, I'll be giving them 3 or 4 snacks if we go post 5 p.m. So at 5 p.m. they have a meal. They're still hungry because they haven't had too many snacks, and then we have the yogurt later.
So we discussed a few supplements when we talked about nutrients earlier. Are there other sort of vitamins that you recommend children consume? And also, what's your view on probiotics with kids?
Yeah, great question. So firstly, my approach is food first wherever possible. And most dietitians would say that. So how can we get our nutrients with food? However, there are certain circumstances where it is not possible. If a child has a known deficiency, whatever that deficiency may be, then of course supplementation can be a really important option. But most parents won't actually know whether their children have a known deficiency. So with vitamin D, like I briefly mentioned before, for children who are higher risk or living in countries where it is hard to absorb from the sun, I'd definitely be giving a vitamin D supplement. You could even consider that for a child up to the age of 5. The New Zealand recommendations say that we do it till 2 years. However, anecdotal evidence suggests that till 5 may be appropriate. Particularly, of course, if you've got a darker skin color or you as the mother had low vitamin D, because then you know that your child potentially was born with lower vitamin D. If you breastfed through the winter, like I mentioned earlier, or preterm infants or those with a lower body weight may find it more difficult to get enough vitamin D. So in that case, it depends on where you are as to what supplements are available. I know in Australia and New Zealand, it's usually recommended that the baby, from once they've established feeding, basically, from a very young age, has 400 international units of vitamin D, and that a breastfeeding woman also has 1,000 units herself. And that should prevent a baby from getting rickets regardless of their vitamin D status. And just for those who don't know, rickets is like the bowing of the legs, a very poor bone formation, which can happen in infancy if a child hasn't had enough vitamin D. It is quite rare, so I don't want to scare anyone, but yeah, for those babies that are higher risk, it is worth supplementing for sure. And then I probably don't need to talk too much about it anymore, but of course, vitamin B12 as well for vegan children.
Yep.
Then another thing I do, if my children are sick, I'm really conscious of vitamin C. And I'm not giving them a supplement. I'm not giving them a chewable tablet. I know there's plenty out there available. I'm giving them 1 to 2 kiwi fruit a day, which can be a lot for a child. If they don't like kiwi fruit, your next best option is probably citrus fruit, so your mandarins and your oranges. But yeah, kiwi fruit has way more vitamin C than any other fruit. Luckily here in Japan and of course in New Zealand, it's readily available. So, so the vitamin C helps to reduce the duration of a cold, and there's pretty good evidence out there to show that it doesn't prevent a cold from coming on, but it can make it shorter, basically. So, that's my go-to there.
Okay.
And then with probiotics, just so people are aware, so probiotics are what people call friendly bacteria or good bacteria. They live in the body and help it to work well, and they can help defend the body from infections caused by unfriendly bacteria or other germs. Probiotics get into the body on their own, so you can get the benefits without doing anything, without taking anything extra. And it's really, really important to be aware that it's a huge money-making industry. We're talking 2022, $64 billion in business, and so there's multiple products out there. Probiotics can come in the form of a pill for adults, powders or liquids for children, and they can also be added to food products. You may have seen them on food products where you live, yogurts, fermented drinks, and they also are in fermented foods too. They're naturally there. I'm much more of a fan of having them from fermented foods rather than taking a pill or a little bit of powder for a child. However, there are some instances where I do think it's appropriate. There's certainly no harm in taking probiotics, and some studies have shown that they do confer quite good benefit. Others show no benefit, so it's important that some of the literature can be quite murky. The main problem with probiotics and studying probiotics is that there are so many different types of probiotics out there. Hundreds of them. And so the different strains need to be studied for a long time and in robust studies to determine whether or not they're effective. Where I do think it's effective for children, and it's sort of a level 1 evidence, so randomized controlled trials and more robust studies, is for antibiotic-associated diarrhea. And that's actually true as well for adults, including a bacteria that can grow after taking antibiotics, which is called C. difficile. So basically what happens is when a child has an infection and they need to take antibiotics, the antibiotics wipe away the good bacteria in the gut, and it can enable the less good bacteria to grow. And in some cases, it can cause the diarrhea to happen. So a Cochrane review, which is a very well-known sort of type of systematic literature review on antibiotic-associated diarrhea in children, concluded that the absolute risk reduction was from 19% to 8% if they took probiotics. So you really are reducing the risk. But yeah, it really also depends on what type of probiotics. And I could go on and on. If anyone has a pen and pencil and they want to write it down, there's Lactobacillus acidophilus, Saccharomyces boulardii, and Lactobacillus rhamnosus. I know they're very wordy, but those are some of the ones. Also sometimes Lactobacillus casei. Those are some of the ones that you will find are quite effective. To give you context, in Australia, it's 65 Australian dollars for a course of these probiotics for children. And it's a particular brand, and they do Saccharomyces and Lactobacillus rhamnosus. And yeah, so you're talking about a lot of money. I'm not sure what that is in yen. Some of them are cheaper, but yeah, it's a lot to spend. They say if you treat 9 children, you'll avoid 1 case of antibiotic-associated diarrhea.
Right.
The other time, there is level 2 evidence for recurrent abdo pain in children, so abdominal pain, where you don't necessarily know what is causing the pain. It is generally lower quality evidence, and I don't have information on the types of probiotics, but I'd probably be going along the same ones as with the antibiotic-associated diarrhea that I mentioned before. But basically, it does no harm. If your child has had a lot of pain in their tummy for a long time, give it a shot. Like, it's not necessarily going to work, but there's no harm in doing it.
Before we wrap up, is there any I guess general words of advice for parents in terms of children's nutrition, especially parents living in Tokyo, in Japan, perhaps have just arrived here and they haven't sort of put the dietary habits in place. Are there any sort of final words of advice?
Yeah, I mean, like with most countries, fresh food, which is usually located around the outside of the supermarkets, is best where possible. The advantage of that is you don't need to use your Translate app to figure out what's in it. So your fresh fruit and vegetables, your meats, your legumes, your dairy products, or soy alternatives. But I think that's quite an obvious one. One thing that I do try and encourage is just to get a variety of colors. So it's quite a simple thing, but just different colored food is going to ensure that your children have a variety of vitamins and minerals that they need. And yeah, don't be afraid to scan. It takes a long time. It took me a long time to figure out what was in the foods, but just what's on the front doesn't necessarily show what's on the back. So I tend to look at the ingredients list more than the nutrition information panel, because there's no information here in Japan on whether a product contains added sugar, as an example. So yeah, I just look at the ingredients list, trying to go for less ingredients rather than more where possible, and trying to avoid sugar as the first, second, or third ingredient on the list, and same with salt or sodium. And that's just because the ingredients that are at the top of the list are the ones that are in the product in the greatest volume. So yeah, that's all I'd say. And yeah, grain foods, starchy vegetables and fruit are great for not just your children's health, but also their gut bacteria and immune system too. So we'll set you up well for the winter.
Very good. So thank you very much for that, Rebecca. That was a very information-dense episode, and I'm sure the listeners got a lot out of it. We're planning a webinar for October the 2nd, which is a Wednesday, from 7 p.m. So we'll have a little bit more time to go into detail about the topics we discussed today, but we'll also be discussing things such as early childhood feeding and starting solids, as well as things like allergies and intolerances. So if you're interested, we'll put a sign-up link in the show notes, or you can DM me or contact Club 360 directly. Finally, Rebecca, if people are interested in booking a consultation directly with you for your dietetics and nutrition services, what are the type of things that you see that you enjoy helping people with?
Yeah, so I see clients with a a range of issues. I see both adults and children. My particular interest with children is those early days of starting solids, which can be quite challenging for parents, particularly if they're a first-time parent, and then just helping with the like fussy eating. But with adults, I'm particularly interested in women's health, so through menopause, for breastfeeding and pregnancy, but also people with different conditions, whether it be heart disease, diabetes, people who are training for a sport or for leisure and just want to optimize their nutrition. So yeah, just jump on the Club 360 website because all the information's there.
Terrific. And you do both in-person and online consultations?
Correct, yeah. First consult's usually an hour and follow-up's half an hour if you need it.
Terrific. All right. Well, Rebecca, thank you very much for coming on. I got a lot out of the episode, and I'm sure the listeners did as well. And we'll look forward to having you back on in a future episode.
Great. Thanks for having me, Sam.
Thank you. Bye.